The smell of roasted garlic and seared steak filled the kitchen as I poured a glass of red wine, my fingers tightening around the stem just enough to keep my thoughts from wandering. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that settled in before my husband came home from work. I liked these moments, when everything was in its place, predictable, controlled. But then the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. Wiping my hands on a dish towel, I made my way to the door, heart beating just a little faster than it should. The second I opened it, I froze. He stood there, framed by the dimming light of dusk, hands in his pockets, head tilted just slightly to the side as if amused by my reaction. I hadn't seen him in years. The last time he was just a lanky teenager, awkward, withdrawn. Now he was taller, broader, his sharp jawline shadowed with the hint of stubble. But it wasn't his appearance that made my stomach twist. It was the way he looked at me. Certain. Like he belonged here. I forced a smile. Surprised, he interrupted smoothly. Before I could answer, the front door swung open wider as my husband stepped in behind me. His face lit up. Son. They embraced, exchanging greetings, but I barely heard them. My pulse thrummed beneath my skin as I felt eyes on me, watching, calculating. And when I met his gaze again, something inside me whispered that this wasn't just a homecoming. It was the beginning of something else. Something I wasn't ready for. Something felt different. It wasn't immediate, not something I could pinpoint right away, but a shift had settled over the house, subtle yet undeniable. He moved through the space too easily, too comfortably, like he had lived here forever. He left his shoes by the door, his jacket on the chair, his presence lingering in every room. I'd turn to grab a pan and he'd already be there, standing too close. I'd fold laundry in the bedroom, and in the reflection of the mirror, I'd catch him leaning against the doorway, watching. Never speaking first. Just watching. When my husband's best friend dropped by for dinner, he chuckled at my distracted responses. "You okay?" he asked, eyes narrowing. I forced a smile, nodding. How could I explain something I wasn't even sure of? Later that night, as I walked toward the bathroom, I stopped short. He was there, standing in the dim hallway, his frame relaxed, his voice quiet but deliberate. "You haven't changed," he murmured. The air felt thick, too heavy, pressing against my skin. I wanted to move, to speak, but for a second I just stood there, unable to breathe. The morning felt heavier than usual. My husband left early, kissing my cheek absent-mindedly before disappearing through the door. I barely registered it. My thoughts were elsewhere. When his best friend texted, asking if I wanted to grab a coffee, I hesitated but agreed. Maybe I needed the distraction. We sat outside at a small cafe, the sun warming my skin, but I still felt that lingering chill from last night. He studied me, his brow slightly furrowed. "You seem off," he said. I exhaled, staring at my untouched drink. "It's nothing," I murmured, but the words felt like a lie. He smirked, shaking his head. "You're overthinking. Maybe you just miss a little attention." I laughed, but it was forced. The air between us changed, charged with something unspoken. His gaze held mine a little too long. The moment stretched. Before I could process it, he leaned in. Or maybe I did. Our lips brushed, brief, fleeting, but enough to steal my breath. I pulled back, heart pounding. Mistake. Second too long. I swallowed hard, but he only watched me, waiting. I avoided him. Not just the friend, him too. The moment at the cafe haunted me, but it was something else that unsettled me now. My husband's son had changed. His presence felt heavier, more deliberate. I'd find his book on the kitchen counter, his jacket draped over the chair I usually sat in, his cologne faintly lingering in the hallway. Small things. Subtle. But enough. At dinner, my husband talked about work, unaware of the silence stretching between us. I reached for the salt and fingers brushed mine. A brief touch, innocent to anyone watching, but when I glanced up, he was already looking at me. Knowing. His fingers lingered a second too long before he pulled away. My husband never noticed. That night my phone buzzed. A single message from an unknown number. "Are you sure you have everything under control?" My throat went dry. I stared at the screen, pulse hammering. It wasn't a question. It was a warning. But from who? And why did it feel like someone was waiting for me to slip? I needed to shake this feeling. It was in my head, that was all. The tension, the glances, the message. Just coincidences, nothing more. I refused to let my mind spiral. I needed normalcy. Stability. I needed my husband. That night after dinner I poured 2 glasses of wine and sat beside him on the couch. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. I leaned in, pressing a slow, deliberate kiss against his lips. He responded, but something was missing. Touch felt rehearsed, distant, as if he was only half there. My stomach twisted, but I pushed the thought away. Maybe it was just stress. Maybe it was me. Then his phone lit up. A message. I pulled back slightly, just enough to glance at the screen. No name, just a number. The text preview was cut off, but the few words I caught made my blood run cold. Before I could read more, he grabbed the phone, turning the screen away. "Work," he muttered. My pulse pounded as I forced a smile, but inside something cracked. Maybe I wasn't the only one keeping secrets. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The tension, the glances, the way he existed in my space, like he was testing boundaries I wasn't sure even existed. And now that message. Someone was watching, waiting. I needed answers. I found him in the living room, legs stretched out, a coffee cup balanced casually in his hand. He looked up as I stepped closer, his expression unreadable. I hesitated, but then forced the words out. "You know something, don't you?" He didn't blink, just took a slow sip, the heat of the cup curling into the air between us. "And what about you?" His voice was light, amused, but something in it sent a shiver down my spine. Before I could react, the front door clicked open. My husband. His footsteps were quick, deliberate. The second he saw us, something shifted in his face. His eyes darted between us. "What are you two talking about?" I opened my mouth, scrambling for something, anything, to say. But my heart was pounding too fast, and he was already looking at me like he knew I was lying. Something had shifted. My husband barely spoke to me now, his presence in the house reduced to hurried footsteps and half-hearted excuses. He worked late, came home even later, and when he did, he barely looked at me. I tried not to let it get to me, but the silence between us had weight. Pressed against my chest, suffocating. His son, on the other hand, was the opposite. More present. More assured. He moved through the house like he was waiting for something, like he knew something I didn't. The way he watched me wasn't subtle anymore. It wasn't hidden. And I hated that I noticed. One afternoon when I was alone, I did something I never thought I would. His door was slightly open. He wasn't home. My pulse pounded as I stepped inside. Everything was neat, calculated, except for the desk. A single photograph lay there. My breath caught. It was of me and my husband smiling for the camera. But the boy standing beside him wasn't looking at his father. His eyes were on me. And the way he looked at me made my stomach twist. She had spent the entire afternoon preparing a surprise for his birthday. The kitchen was a mess. Flour on the counter, frosting smeared on her apron, and the rich scent of freshly baked treats filling the air. She wanted to make this day special, knowing how much he loved homemade desserts. After hours of work, she finally set everything on the table. The centerpiece of the celebration was his favorite, a huge, triple-layered chocolate cake she had carefully decorated. As he sat down, eyes wide with excitement, she couldn't help but smile. She took a bite, savoring the rich, sweet flavor. I ate my adopted son's huge thing on his birthday, she thought with amusement, knowing he had always bragged about how this cake was the biggest and best she had ever made. But as laughter filled the room and voices overlapped, her mind was elsewhere. The photograph. The message. The way her husband had been avoiding her. She couldn't ignore it anymore. When the guests left, she confronted him. "Tell me the truth. You've been distant. I know something's wrong." His jaw tightened. "I should be asking you that," he snapped. "How long has this been going on?" Her stomach dropped. He knew. He had known all along. Before she could speak, the door opened. His best friend. He froze at the sight of her tear-streaked face, concern flashing in his eyes. The weight of everything crushed her, and without thinking, she reached for him. His lips met hers in an instant, desperate, familiar. And then footsteps. A sharp intake of breath. She turned. Her husband stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. The world around her shattered. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the empty house. He was gone. The suitcases were packed, his cold eyes avoiding hers as he walked out, not a word spoken. The finality of it hit her like a wave, drowning everything in its path. She stood there, frozen, unable to move as the quiet settled in. His absence was deafening. She hadn't expected this, but somewhere deep down she knew it was coming. His best friend standing at the door paused. He looked at her with a strange, unreadable expression, then shook his head. It was inevitable, he whispered before turning and leaving without another glance. The sound of his footsteps faded, leaving her in the overwhelming silence. But she wasn't truly alone, was she? A shadow stirred in the hallway, and from the darkness he stepped into view. Her husband's son. His eyes were heavy with something she couldn't place, something sharp. He watched her for a moment before speaking. You ruined everything, you know that? The words were casual, but the weight of them crushed her. She opened her mouth to respond, to defend herself, but he simply smiled, a quiet, almost amused curve of his lips, before turning and walking away. The papers arrived just days later. Divorce papers. He didn't even look at her when he handed them over, his eyes void of any emotion. The life she had built was slipping through her fingers, and with it, every ounce of trust, every piece of stability. Her family shattered. Her husband was gone, the connection severed, and nothing remained. The house felt empty without him, without the noise of their once thriving home. Her husband's best friend stopped returning her calls. The phone left ringing, unanswered, as if she had never mattered to him in the first place. She moved out, packed everything into boxes and bags, leaving behind memories that now felt like ghosts. New apartment. New town. But the nightmares didn't end. Each night she awoke in a cold sweat, heart racing, as though someone was watching her, waiting for her to slip. It was like being in a cage no matter how far she ran. Sometimes she could almost hear a familiar voice, soft, barely audible but unmistakable, whispering through the silence of the night. It couldn't be real, she told herself. It couldn't. But every time the sound echoed in the dark, she wasn't so sure.